The heavy steel vault groaned on its hinges, swinging open for the first time in 22 years. Sunlight sliced into the blackness like a knife, slowly waking up decades of dust that blanketed everything. The thick dust drifted up through the sharp beams of daylight, looking just like pale smoke. The shape waiting beneath that canvas tarp was absolutely unmistakable. Low, wide, and boasting aggressive lines that decades of neglect could never truly hide. A 1979 BMW M1 prototype, just one of 49 ever made, left behind in the dark when the production line moved on. Master mechanic Dominic Walsh froze at the door. His rough hands hung loose, and he barely breathed for a long moment. He instantly recognized this impossible machine. He knew every bolt, every seam, and the stubborn silence of this impossible engine, because over 2 decades ago he was the absolute last man alive to ever touch it. Right behind him stood Giselle Hartwell. Her arms were tightly crossed, a faint smirk forming that definitely didn't mean she was happy. "If you can make it run," she challenged, $10 million is yours. What she didn't know, what you and I are about to uncover, was that this quiet single dad was the only guy alive who truly understood why this automotive treasure had died 22 years ago. Dominic Walsh was 41 years old, and just looking at him, there was absolutely nothing special to see. He got up every single day at 5:15 a.m. in a tiny rented house over in Hartford, Connecticut. He brewed coffee using a cheap maker he stubbornly fixed 8 times rather than replacing. Then he waited to hear those tiny footsteps shuffling down the hallway. And the second his little girl, Violet, appeared in the doorway, holding her stuffed bear tight, half her hair totally flattened against her head from a deep sleep. His anxious mind found peace, finding harmony like a restored motor humming when the fuel mix is flawless. 7-year-old Violet inherited her mother's beautiful eyes. They were wide, dark brown, and deep. Always watching closely, she made grown-ups feel like she understood way more than the simple words they were speaking. She flopped right into her usual seat at the kitchen table. She placed her favorite bear, Walnut, neatly beside her cereal bowl, then locked her dark eyes on her dad. "Are you coming home on time tonight?" "On time," Dominic promised her quietly. He leaned against the worn counter, downing his black coffee on his feet, just like every morning. "You claimed that yesterday. Yesterday, an urgent auto repair came up. Tonight will be completely different." Violet ripped open her breakfast and stayed totally quiet, but she deliberately turned Walnut to stare straight at him, silently demanding he keep that promise. Outside their window, the tall oak trees lining the neighborhood sidewalk were already fading. The bitter October chill was sweeping down from the north, blowing the dying autumn leaves away fast. But we know Dominic was once known as one of the finest car restoration experts on the East Coast. In his 20s, he spent 3 tough years in Munich, training under a brilliant German engineer named Gerhard Wolfe, a man who directly built the legendary BMW M Series development program in the 1970s. Gerhard was notoriously cold, and he definitely was not a kind or forgiving mentor, but he recognized a rare hidden treasure inside Dominic that he almost never saw. A deep way of listening, beyond basic mechanics, finding the hidden soul inside the problem. Near the end of those 3 years, Gerhard finally told him a crucial secret. "You don't just fix cars, Dominic. You have a conversation with them." At just 20 years old, Dominic hadn't fully grasped what the grumpy old engineer was trying to say. By age 30, we know he finally understood it completely. You and I know true treasure hides. At 21, he returned, quietly building a referral-only reputation. By 28, he had revived 4 impossible classic BMW M Series machines from the 70s, a pristine 1967 Ferrari, and a Jaguar Roadster abandoned as a lost cause in some Vermont barn for 31 years. He avoided fame, but the elite trusted his genius. Then tragedy struck and Sarah died. Pancreatic cancer moved far faster than any of the stunned doctors had ever prepared them for. 4 brutal months from diagnosis to the end. Dominic was battling a tough Porsche 911 restoration in Boston when she got the news. He drove home that very evening and just never returned. He sold off his specialized tools, the absolute treasures he spent years carefully hunting down. He called every client and contractor, bluntly telling them he was taking an indefinite leave. He never expected to go back, and he didn't, not to that brilliant version of himself. Now he just wrenched at Aaron Mill's humble garage, 12 short minutes from his empty house, grinding through simple oil changes, basic brake jobs, and routine transmission flushes. Aaron was a decent boss who never asked for impossible miracles, and that suited Dominic perfectly. His small paycheck covered rent and Violet's schooling, and maybe a fresh box of wax crayons when her old ones wore down to nothing. Every single night, once Violet was asleep, Dominic retreated to his tiny hidden backyard workshop space. Not a real garage, just a cramped puzzle barely fitting a wooden workbench and a stool. There, he opened the notebook hidden like treasure in his locked drawer. Its yellowing pages were packed with intricate hand-drawn engine diagrams. Brilliant technical notes in both English and German. The quiet traces of a genius mind that was once truly alive to its incredible purpose. You and I all have hidden depths. He kept his locked securely away, unsure why he bothered. He didn't know it yet, but that Tuesday evening, his impossible problem would find its answer. Owen Bradshaw called around 7 p.m., right as Dominic scrubbed the last of the dinner plates. Owen was an old buddy from their vocational school. They tackled complex auto mechanics together 20 years ago inside a tough Connecticut program. But their paths completely diverged shortly after that. Owen went totally corporate, steadily climbing up to senior technician at Hartwell Automotive Group, a massive high-end car restoration empire spanning the entire New England region. They rarely saw each other, but Owen always called when things truly mattered the most. Dom, did you catch the unbelievable news this week? No. Hartwell finally opened the sealed storage vault down in their main sub-basement. Locked tight since 2004, a heavy pause. A 1979 BMW M1 prototype original chassis. The impossible puzzle they locked away. Dominic stopped wiping his dish. Dom, you know the absolute treasure I mean. Keep going. Giselle Hartwell, Richard's kid. She runs the empire since Richard died. She just held a massive press conference today. Public challenge, a legally notarized contract. Revive this impossible treasure in 7 days, take home $10 million. We'd all be tempted. Application shut this Friday. Dominic slowly sank into the wooden kitchen chair. From the living room, he heard Violet dragging her wax crayons across rough paper. How many applied? 47 today. The impossible was calling him. Certified BMW engineers gave up. An elite restoration crew from Stuttgart failed. Even the master who rebuilt a McLaren F1 in Scottsdale walked away defeated. Owen, yeah, why are you really calling? A heavy telling pause. Because I was inside that sealed vault today, Dom. I saw the forgotten car. And wedged under the cracked leather passenger seat, right against the door panel, I spotted something. Owen dropped his voice to a whisper, a blue notebook. I instantly recognized the handwriting. Dominic completely stopped breathing right then. It is yours, Owen whispered. I kept quiet, but you have to come in. Let's watch the press footage Dominic easily tracked down next morning. Giselle Hartwell guarded the open vault door, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal power suit. Camera flashes erupted all around her like tiny blinding white explosions. She was 32, projecting the unshakable confidence of someone who had spent her entire adult life in corporate rooms where everyone always deferred to her. A Wharton business degree, a spotless professional record, but absolutely zero technical mechanic credentials of any kind. She spoke smoothly about the buried treasure, that 1979 prototype chassis, and her grandfather's purchase of the vehicle in 1982. Then she dropped the impossible challenge, smiling like she was doing the entire automotive world a massive favor by letting them try. Dominic watched the clip finish, then slowly shut his heavy laptop. Stick with me here. He stood up, walked to the back door, and finally grabbed his old work jacket. Hidden in the right pocket, folded tight, sat 3 pages of handwritten notes from an impossible problem he never finished solving. He threw the jacket on and drove straight to Hartwell Automotive Group. The Hartwell lobby was all glass and brushed steel, filled with that sterile silence only wildly expensive air systems can create. The front receptionist glared at him, the exact way staff in shiny towers like this always judge blue-collar men walking in. Wearing flannel and worn work boots, a polite but extremely careful blankness. Submitting an application for the Impossible Restoration Challenge, Dominic stated. Company or individual? Individual. He sat for 40 long minutes on a plush leather reception chair. Around him, rival treasure hunters came and went. A squad of German engineers in sharp suits lugging laptops and heavy diagnostic gear. A famous California restorer Dominic recognized from an auto magazine cover. 2 university engineering professors whispering to each other in complex technical shorthand. You and I know that look. Everyone glanced away. Jason Keller spotted him first. Keller ran Hartwell's internal mechanical division. 48, heavy-set, flashing a shiny silver watch that no real, hands-on mechanic had any business wearing on the job. He had personally led 3 distinct attempts to revive that forgotten M1 over the past 5 years. All 3 tries completely failed. His entire career at Hartwell rested purely on the ego and authority of being the one guy who had supposedly gotten closest to the prize. He halted right in front of Dominic. His face shifted into a smug look that wasn't exactly amusement, but it was painfully close. "Walsh, what are you doing here? Submitting an application?" Keller stared down at the handwritten form clutched in Dominic's hand. Then he looked at Dominic with the arrogant expression of a man watching a spectacle he finds deeply confusing, yet faintly entertaining. "You're doing basic brake jobs for Aaron Mills. You want to tell me what you think you're actually going to achieve? What can you do with a 1979 prototype my 30-year veterans couldn't touch?" Dominic stayed quiet. Right then Giselle Hartwell stepped out from the main corridor. Charlotte Reeves walked behind her, holding a clipboard. Giselle scanned the room. Her eyes locked on Dominic like he was a smudge on a priceless painting. "Who are you?" she asked flatly, skipping any polite introductions. "Dominic Walsh, here to submit my official application." She checked his paper, then stared down at his rough hands, calluses and deeply stained nails, despite heavy scrubbing. "Where do you work now?" "Mills Garage, Hartford." A short pause. "That is a local community shop, yes. You know our other applicants include certified BMW engineering teams and elite Pebble Beach concourse specialists." "I understand that, Giselle." She studied him a second longer. Then her entire expression shifted. She decided this whole thing was amusing, dismissing him as a real threat. "Application accepted, Walsh." She kept walking, never breaking her stride. "Good luck." As Giselle vanished down the hall, Keller slapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Do not waste your week," he warned, sounding almost gentle. "That old car has been completely dead for 20 years. Dominic grabbed his freshly stamped paperwork and tucked it quietly into his coat. "It isn't dead," he replied quietly. "It's just been sleeping. You and I should rewind to 2003. Dominic was 21 and freshly back from Munich when Richard Hartwell first reached out. Richard was 60 back then, still very lean and sharp. He built his empire on a deep love for real machinery, not just the massive inherited wealth that followed. He owned BMW M1 prototype chassis 43079, one of 49 hand-built cars created by the Barcoach Works in Stuttgart. This happened before production versions ever hit the official manufacturing lines. Richard bought it in 1982 from a Zurich collector for $300,000. The hidden gem sat sealed inside climate-controlled storage for most of those years. Driven barely at all, maintained poorly, last run in 1996. Dominic scored a strict 6-month diagnostic and full restoration contract. Moving his tools into the Hartwell vault, he spent 6 weeks learning the car exactly how Gerhard taught him, completely, patiently, making zero assumptions. He tracked down and read every scrap of original documentation available. He even exchanged letters with a retired bar engineer in Stuttgart who actually remembered the old prototype program. He stripped the machine piece by piece, logging everything inside the blue notebook he always carried. He found the hidden problems, not 1, 3. Let's look closely. They were layered together like geological strata. The main issue hid deep inside the Kugel-Fischer mechanical fuel injection system. A thick sludge of metallic sediment blocked the pressure control chamber, caused by an experimental alloy composition BMW tested during that 1979 prototype run. They quietly dropped it later because the metal rotted away in exactly this frustrating way. Every hotshot specialist before him stared at the impossible problem and blamed the fuel pump. The pump was fine, the prize hid behind the broken pressure chamber. It was an impossible riddle, the kind only solved by someone who truly understood the difference between a part's official rating and reality. Let's figure out what a broken component was actually doing. The second impossible problem hid in the Bosch ignition board's moisture. Decades of dampness had ruined the logic circuit so badly that it required reprogramming, not just replacing. Nobody had built those specific parts since 1993. Swapping in a new board was useless. The real puzzle lived deep inside the logic architecture. The hardware condition wasn't the issue. The third flaw was the hardest to spot, but deadly if missed. A microscopic crack hiding deep inside the engine mount structure, completely invisible to the naked eye. A factory stress point in that rare prototype chassis, something BMW had never actually admitted to the public. Dominic had finally found it by running his bare hands over the front mount's lower left corner, sitting in pitch black, feeling for a tiny razor-thin crack that had been secretly hiding there since day one. He mapped all 3 impossible problems inside a blue notebook with obsessive, exhaustive detail. Every single measurement, every material spec, the exact teardown and rebuild sequences needed to fix each impossible flaw. It was easily the most intense diagnostic manual he had ever put together, fueled by a gut feeling he couldn't explain at 21, but totally understood by 41. You see, some hard work needs to be recorded like it matters, because it genuinely does. Then Richard Hartwell suffered a stroke. The interim boss, Richard's son, stepping in until Giselle was old enough, instantly killed off all projects that didn't make quick cash. Dominic got fired over a quick phone call that Thursday afternoon. They told him the storage vault was sealed tight and he was banned from ever going back to grab his own tools. They paid 60% of his contract. No warning, no real reason, 0 exceptions. That priceless blue notebook was locked inside the car. 22 years ago, the new schedule handed Dominic a rigid 6 to noon slot every single morning. During the challenge, he could stay until 8 at night for the first 2 days. He dropped Violet with Eleanor Marsh, a retired teacher who was 68. Aside from Owen, she was the only human he trusted completely with his little girl. Violet paused at the front door looking back. "Is it the car?" she asked him. Dominic treated the difficult question with genuine, heavy seriousness. "Possibly," he told her. She studied him quietly, looking just like Sarah. "Be careful," she whispered, stepping inside. He pulled up to the concrete vault before 6 on Saturday. The guard scanned his pass, noted the time, and went back to his coffee. Dominic walked into the freezing, pitch-black storage room and rigged his portable light. He froze, staring at the vintage BMW M1 bathed in cheap yellow light. Someone pulled the canvas cover off for the big viewing. The day prior, leaving the classic car exposed, its paint faded to a flat, dusty silver from 20 years in the dark. Tires totally flat. The glass was choked by a thick layer of dust, settling over the decades like an unbroken blanket of snow. But let me tell you, that shape remained exactly what Gerhard promised. Low, aggressive, wearing that iconic Giugiaro Bodyworks famous wedge profile. Those unforgettable side air intakes. The glass angled so aggressively, making this forgotten BMW look like it was tearing down the highway even sitting perfectly still. It lacked that cheap, shiny beauty of a showroom model. But you and I know the real beauty is in survival. A masterpiece tested by decades of silence, proving its worth behind an impossible mountain of problems. Dominic stepped to the passenger side. That old hinge groaned. He carefully lifted and pulled, saving the fragile pin, then dug beneath the cracked leather of the old bucket seat. His hand finally grabbed the little blue notebook. Out it came. 22 years of dust spilled off the cover as he flipped open that very first page. BMW M1 prototype diagnosis, Walsh D. November 2003. His own handwriting, 22 years younger, stared right back at him from the faded paper. He placed the logbook on the shop bench, turned to the old diagnostics, and started working. Those first 2 days, pure teardown and checking every single detail. 0 repairs, absolutely no new parts. He compared every old note against the vintage car right now, hunting down any extra decay hidden by 2 decades of silence. Those 3 major engine faults? Exactly the impossible problems he remembered. But new headaches had quietly grown in the shadows over the years. Brittle, dried-out rubber seals choking the fuel lines. Nasty little patches of rust eating at the engine bay wiring. A bone-dry gas tank demanding a deep, brutal internal scrub before holding a single drop. He mapped these hidden hurdles on fresh paper. Let's watch him work. He ordered vintage BMW parts through Owen out in Pennsylvania. Tapped a classic parts dealer in Nuremberg, then mapped out his grueling battle plan for the week. By the second night, Giselle marched straight into the sealed vault. Dom was underneath the chassis, a flashlight gripped in his teeth, listening to her sharp heels click against the cold concrete floor. "Making progress, Walsh." Moving forward, he muttered from the shadows. Heavy silence. Those clicking heels stopped dead. The German squad ripped apart their whole fuel system today. They even scored factory original components from Nuremberg. Dom stayed completely silent. "I am only sharing this," Giselle pushed on, keeping her voice coldly professional instead of openly aggressive. "Because your odds of fixing this impossible problem are dead last in the competition. Strictly business, right?" He slid out from under the heavy metal, sat up on the floor and stared her down. His expression was pure stone. "Thanks for the update," he fired back calmly. She locked eyes with him just a second too long, then turned back toward the heavy exit. He watched her leave, then got back to work. Day 3 started off brutal. He walked in at 6 a.m. to find his main tool bag shifted. Not stolen, just sitting in the wrong spot. Far worse, that handmade pressure testing rig he hauled from his home garage. He spent 2 weeks building it just to check the injection chamber, without pulling everything apart. Now, it sat dismantled and slapped together totally wrong. The delicate calibration was trashed. A rival had invaded his sanctuary. Owen showed up at 8, sweating bullets. Jason Keller had swiped into the secure vault late last night, claiming he needed to grab some left-behind gear. Here's the catch. Keller had 0 tools down there. Want to file a formal complaint with Charlotte? Owen asked. No, Dom replied. The damage is trivial. I can recalibrate in 40 minutes. Filing takes longer than that and costs time I simply don't have. Owen quietly watched his friend work. He'd known Dominic 20 years. He recognized that rare absolute stillness in his friend's face. It wasn't patience, not the way normal people understand it. It was the complete erasure of everything except the impossible problem right in front of him. The real crisis on day 3 wasn't Keller at all, it was the parts. Those custom parts from Germany, stuck in customs for another 24 hours. The Kugel-Fischer pressure chamber insert, the absolute heart of the repair, was delayed until Monday morning. Without that insert, the main fault was completely impossible to fix. And without fixing that first, his entire plan to revive this treasure totally fell apart. He called Aaron. I need 606106 aluminum 3 millimeters thick and a CNC. Who do you know? Aaron stayed quiet for a second. Sam Whitfield down on Trumbull Street. He's closing shop and selling his equipment. You will have to talk him into this yourself. Samuel Whitfield was 70 years old. He had been a precision machinist for 40 of them. He didn't know about the hidden BMW, and he couldn't care less about $10 million. But when Dominic started describing the exact dimensional specs of the impossible part he needed built, listing off tight tolerances, surface finishes, and how the alloy behaves at operating temperatures, Samuel listened closely to the whole thing without interrupting once. At the end, he just said, "Come by this afternoon." Dominic left the vault at 11 and drove straight to Trumbull Street. He stood by Samuel's CNC lathe for 4 hours, guiding the build of a replacement insert accurate to 0.02 of an inch. After 6, he returned to the vault, the priceless new component wrapped in clean cloth inside his pocket. The 4th day was the big one. Dominic had dreaded it all week. It meant facing the microfracture deep in the engine mount. And the strict contest rules strictly prohibited specialized diagnostic hardware, just to keep the playing field completely equal among everyone. He didn't even need an ultrasonic scanner anyway. He knew exactly where that flaw hid. 22 millimeters below the second bolt on the forward mount's lower left side, running lengthwise for about 8 millimeters. He reached right in and found it with just a fingertip, the exact same way he felt it back in 2003. Working in the dark, he traced his index finger over the cold metal until that tiny hidden ridge of a fracture finally caught against his bare skin. It was completely unchanged. You and I know a structural crack either spreads under pressure or stays perfectly stable in storage. This problem had waited in the dark for 22 years. He didn't try to weld it. Welding introduces serious heat stress to the surrounding metal, which would only make the impossible problem worse. Instead, he relied on a cold bond reinforcement trick using metal compound epoxy. He applied it carefully alongside a perfectly cut aluminum backing plate. He held it under intense pressure with a custom clamp made from scrap materials while the epoxy cured. Gerhard taught him this secret for fragile parts you just couldn't remove for a normal repair. When done right, it was actually stronger than a weld for unlocking this specific kind of treasure. Let's take a breath here. Violet called at 11 while he waited for that first layer to cure. He put his brush down and answered, "Are you okay?" She asked, "Fine. Are you okay?" "Yes." A heavy pause followed, the kind where a child gathers courage to speak. "Mrs. Marsh told me you used to fix really special cars. She said you were the best, and you just didn't know it." Dominic stared deep into the abandoned BMW M1's engine bay, bathed in a warm yellow work light. "You and I know this. The exposed classic car held a raw honesty that sealed finished puzzles never do." "She's a generous woman," he whispered. "Bah." She used the Vietnamese word for father, a hidden treasure inherited from Sarah, who used it with her parents. "Do you think about Mom when you're working?" The impossible question hit like a sudden drop in pressure. "Yes," he said. Me too, Violet murmured. I think she wants you to finish the car. He froze for a long, heavy moment. I'll finish it, he promised. Sleep well tonight. He ended the call, his hand resting heavily on the phone. Then he grabbed his detailing brush and kept digging. Charlotte Reeves entered the sealed vault that evening, alone, missing her usual clipboard armor. She paused at the threshold before finally speaking. I've been digging through the company archives, she said. 2003, Richard Hartwell hired you on a 6-month diagnostic and restoration contract for this exact vehicle. The agreement was cut short after 3.5 months when Richard suffered his stroke. The company paid out 60% of the contract, skipping formal notice and providing zero written justification for ending it. Dominic slowly set his torque wrench down. That 40%, with standard interest compounded over 22 years, totals $460,000, Charlotte added. That is entirely separate from the main contest prize. The firm owes you this treasure, regardless of how this week concludes. I didn't step in here for a lawsuit, Dominic replied. I know. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the hidden value owed to you. He stared. What made you dig into that impossible problem? Charlotte fell completely silent. Because you spend 3 days working in here, and you do not act like someone chasing a prize. She placed her clipboard against the wall. You work like a man desperately trying to finish something hidden. Once she vanished, Dominic faced the engine bay again, standing perfectly still in the heavy silence. We both know people start things and never finish them, not from a lack of skill or pure will, but because life violently shifts in directions we never planned, and some impossible projects get locked behind closed doors, buried alongside everything else you could not carry when running away so fast. Those buried problems never disappear. They linger, the way impossible puzzles always wait at the edge of your mind, haunting a space nothing else could ever hope to fill. He had carried the crushing weight of this vintage BMW restoration for 22 years without ever naming it. Standing inside the silent vault now, the forgotten machine opened up before him, with his tools arranged perfectly, and the ancient notebook pages flipped to the exact right section. He realized $10 million was not the real reason he walked through those doors. The money was just a consequence. The real treasure was simpler, yet harder to explain. You and I see it now. Impossible work demands the right hands, and his were the only ones left. He finally picked up the wrench. Day 5 was the final full working shift before the classic demonstrations. At 4 in the morning, Dominic sat at his kitchen table, staring down the impossible remaining task list before him. 5 remaining items. The imported German parts landed Monday afternoon exactly as promised. The workspace was completely staged. Dominic had exactly 9 hours of vault access. He jotted the target times in the margin, checking his math twice. Impossible tasks demand absolute precision. It was just barely possible. Assuming no further disasters, Dominic started at 6. Keller walked in at 7. The massive room meant they never actually had to share space, yet Keller completely ignored his own workbench. He froze halfway across the room. He just stood there, staring at how Dominic transformed this forgotten vintage BMW over 4 grueling days. The engine bay was totally reassembled. The entire fuel injection system looked flawless. That complex pump was pristine. The pressure chamber swapped with Samuel's custom insert. Every single line was routed perfectly, with fresh sealing compound locking down each joint. The fragile vintage ignition wiring harness was carefully cleaned and rerouted wherever heavy oxidation had stiffened the cables. The reinforced engine mounts were rock solid. The gas tank was scrubbed out and topped off. All 4 original tires were finally holding the correct air pressure once again. Outwardly, the treasure remained hidden. The classic car's paint was still dull, aged, and flat. The heavy body panels still wore the dust of 22 forgotten years. But you and I know the real story was hiding right under that hood. The mechanical message was crystal clear. You brought back the original pump, Keller muttered. It never needed replacing. The pressure chamber was just blocked, packed with metallic sediment inside the pressure passage. I machined a brand new insert for the intake side. Clean passage, original pump, flawless original function. Dominic kept his eyes glued to the engine build. Keller stood absolutely speechless. The expert leaned in closer, studying that complicated fuel injection assembly. He scrutinized every rebuilt piece with the deep intensity of a guy who had tried and utterly failed to solve this exact same riddle. The impossible problem wasn't impossible at all. He just realized he had been looking in the completely wrong place. "You've worked on this exact car before," he finally said. It wasn't a question, it was pure realization. Dominic just grabbed his torque wrench. Keller lingered for one more heavy moment, then slowly retreated to his workbench in total silence. "Now, you and I need to look at the real impossible problem here. Reprogramming that vintage ignition board was the hardest task. Modern software just did not exist for this. That original 1979 Bosch control board was not listed in any modern mechanic database. Nobody had supported this archaic technology for decades. Its entire logic architecture predated every single modern computer diagnostic tool by a massive margin. The previous German experts planned to just swap it for a newer compatible replacement board. Dominic took a fundamentally different, completely manual approach instead. Inside his worn blue notebook, on pages 41 through 48, he had mapped the entire logic sequence of the original board. He mapped it point by point using a basic multimeter, over 6 hours in November 2003, written in his own unique shorthand, because standard documentation simply did not exist anymore. To this day, it was the most precise piece of technical engineering he had ever done, and he documented it with the obsessive care of a mechanic who truly understood the stakes. He knew even back then that unlocking this hidden treasure might one day become absolutely vital. Dominic gently flipped the old notebook to page 41. The manual reprogramming took exactly 2 hours and 18 minutes. One crossed wire, and you and I both know the sequence fails. There was absolutely zero time left for second chances. He worked in dead silence. No radio, no checking the clock. Just the circuit board, his notebook, and hands perfectly tracing steps he wrote 22 years ago under a single work lamp. Because you and I know true treasures hide behind impossible problems. At exactly 4:13 p.m., he hooked the board back to the main circuit and applied power. The dashboard warning lights woke up in sequence, 1, 2, 3, each glowing in perfect order, exactly how the original factory startup logic demanded. Then one by one they faded black, system running nominal. Dominic dropped his testing lead and sat there, completely frozen for a second. Owen arrived right at 5. He paused at the edge of the bay, staring at the rebuilt engine, the spotless space, and the perfectly routed electrical wiring. He stayed quiet for a bit. "Dom," he finally said, "you actually did it." "Not yet," Dominic replied. "One step left." Owen just stared. "What step?" Dominic held his gaze. "Starting it up." Violet called around 6 that evening. "Are you almost done?" "Almost. Are you going to win?" Dominic stared at the vintage BMW M1 resting under the light. The paint still showed its age. The body wore every scar time gave it. But underneath that worn shell, he felt a pure certainty. Rebuilding every single component by hand reveals the magic hiding inside the machine. The treasure was finally ready to wake up. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "I did everything I possibly could." The phone went totally quiet for a moment. "That's enough then," Violet replied. "Mrs. Marsh always says that's enough." He cracked his first real smile in 5 days. "I'll be home before 8. He told her, "Set Walnut at my spot for dinner." The final showdown was locked in for 10 a.m. on Friday morning. The vault's massive steel door finally rolled up, revealing the loading bay where the wide concrete pad offered plenty of room. Enough space to drag these forgotten machines out for the judges to evaluate. Giselle Hartwell stood with the 5 judges, Charlotte, and 2 corporate lawyers. They even hired an outside master mechanic just for this event, plus a cameraman, brought in to record every single moment. The morning dragged on as the other hopeful mechanics took their turns. The German restoration team begged for a 3-day delay, just to finish tracking down rare parts. The judges shut them down. Contest rules were absolutely strict, so they quit. The California specialist actually got his car cranked. The motor sputtered, running violently rough for 17 agonizing seconds until a terrible knocking sound forced him to kill it. His second try gave him absolutely nothing. He packed up. 3 more challengers failed to even reach the testing phase. Their engines either stayed dead or threw safety codes before they even had a chance to warm up. Then Jason Keller stepped up. He ran a 2-man crew for 7 straight days, and their prep work looked completely solid. The old BMW he was wrenching on actually fired up. It choked and struggled, staying alive for 42 seconds before the thermal safety system killed the power permanently. The judging panel quietly wrote his final time down. Keller just stood there, hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the dirt. Dominic was up last. He pushed the M1 onto the apron himself. Rules demanded manual pushing to prevent indoor fires. Now let's see if this impossible problem finally yields its treasure. Sunlight finally touched this hidden treasure for the first time in 22 years. Under the bright light, that aged paint felt honest. It wore its impossible history without a single apology. The low shape of that Giugiaro body, the steep angled windshield, the long clean line of the sill, none of its magic had faded. Time had not ruined this buried treasure. It just gained a deeper presence, the stubborn aura of a masterpiece that survived an impossible test. Giselle stepped up to study the BMW engine bay which Dominic left open before pushing it out. She stood staring at the complex puzzle for a moment in silence. Then she noticed the passenger seat. That blue notebook lay open right there to the messy diagnostic pages. Charlotte stood right behind her, tracking that gaze before looking straight at Dominic. "Walsh," Giselle asked quietly, "that notebook?" "Mine," Dominic replied. "Left it right here back in 2003. Last time I stood in this building." The entire loading bay went dead silent. Giselle stared at him, her carefully managed professional mask from all week completely shattered. Gone was that polite half-smile she had worn during every single exchange since Monday. She looked right at him with the face of someone realizing this impossible mechanic was the actual treasure she had completely misjudged. The independent judge stepped up. "Mr. Walsh, you may begin when ready." Dominic pulled the driver's door open. It swung smoothly. He had carefully oiled every single hinge on this beast by Tuesday. He dropped into the seat, adjusted the old backrest, and sat quietly inside that narrow, forgotten cockpit. The scent was 22 years of cracked leather, thick dust, and old rubber hiding a deeply pure, raw mechanical treasure underneath. The distinct metallic scent of a perfect engine that slept for decades, finally ready to wake. He knew that smell from Munich, from dark garages where a hidden masterpiece waited for the impossible. He scanned the dashboard gauges and gripped that vintage wheel. He exhaled. You and I watched him turn the key. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was only the grinding spin of that old starter motor. The sheer effort of a system fighting a long coma. Heavy pistons finally trying to move. That Kugelfischer pump shoving pressure through ancient fuel lines for the first time in 20-plus years. The sound was deeply deliberate and patient. The noise of a hidden treasure, slowly remembering exactly what it was born to do. Then the engine violently caught. No sputtering at all. It never labored. It roared out of silence into a deep, beautiful idle in exactly 2 seconds flat. A sound that felt just like Gerhard described 40 years ago. Much more like a symphony than basic machinery. A rich, steady, beautiful note from a classic 4-liter straight six that had waited 22 years for one man to solve its impossible puzzle. Nobody in that massive loading bay moved. The dashboard temperature climbed from dead cold, past warm, settling perfectly in the right range with a steadiness showing us that not one single hidden part was struggling. 0 warning lights flashing. Not a single rough patch in that glorious engine note. No forced shutdown either. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Dominic finally killed the motor, pushed the door open, and stepped out. You and I both see it. He stood silently in the October sunlight while Giselle stared. For the first time all week, she didn't have to hide her absolute shock. The world's best treasures hide behind impossible problems. That boardroom was dead quiet. Charlotte slid the notarized $10 million contract right onto the table. It matched every single public term Giselle had announced when this grueling vintage car restoration started. Dominic stared at the life-changing document for a brief moment. That impossible payout meant a real house for Violet, a sprawling green backyard and a warm bedroom soaked in beautiful morning light. It meant any private school she wanted. It meant his own mechanic workshop, buying back the specialized tools he sold years ago, plus gear he never could afford. He gently set the pen down without signing anything. "I need to ask you something directly," he stated. Giselle just waited. "Do you know why this classic BMW was locked away for 22 years? Silence. It wasn't impossible to fix, and plenty of qualified auto mechanics actually existed. The interim corporate board decided back in 2004 that restoring this prototype, with 0 standard production use, just wasn't worth the heavy financial investment." He held her gaze steadily. An original prototype chassis like this one, matching numbers, fully documented history at today's international auction prices. It was worth $8 to $10 million before I even touched a wrench. Running perfectly and fully certified, it's worth vastly more than that. You didn't launch this public challenge because you genuinely believed the revival was impossible. You did it because you thought no one could revive it in 7 days without bottomless pockets and direct BMW factory support. You and I know the treasure was close. The boardroom froze completely. You're absolutely correct, she admitted. That was my exact reasoning, and now? She released a heavy breath. It was the absolute first unguarded moment he had witnessed all week long. And now I owe you $10 million. Dominic finally grabbed the pen and signed. With the contract fully signed, Charlotte dropped a second thick folder onto the table. The remaining balance from your 2003 standard contract. 22 years of interest totals $460,000. The corporation will wire a separate settlement payment. Dominic just stared at her. You really didn't have to. That financial obligation existed long before this week. Charlotte replied, It absolutely should have been settled long before this week. Giselle quietly folded both hands on the table. And about Thursday in the lobby, when I said your chances of reviving this car were the lowest in our entire applicant pool, I was unfairly dismissive in a way that just wasn't warranted. She paused. I sincerely apologize. Dominic stayed perfectly quiet for a moment. You just didn't know what you didn't know, he replied. That's different from bad faith. He exited the Hartwell high-rise at 4 o'clock, driving straight to Eleanor Marsh's house. Violet bolted outside before he even reached the front porch. Stuffed walnut tucked under her arm, blue crayon smeared on her cheek from whatever masterpiece she was drawing. She froze upon seeing his face, tilting her head like a puppy. Done, she asked softly. Did the big car run? He crouched right down to her eye level. Yes, he smiled. The engine ran. She threw both little arms tightly around his neck and just held on. Walnut squeezed tightly between them. Dominic finally let his eyes close. He immediately thought about Sarah. About that final, quiet afternoon in the hospital. She squeezed his hand, begging him not to abandon his auto mechanic passion permanently, to give it up for Violet. Pause for Violet, sure, but the greatest treasures survive the longest, impossible waits. Let's look at this together. He thought back to that blue notebook and those 6 freezing hours, trapped inside the vault. It was November. He mapped that ignition board by hand, point by point, because his gut understood the hidden treasure. Even at 21, he knew that kind of obsessive precision showed pure respect. He remembered Gerhard Wolfe's voice echoing in his head, You have a conversation with it. And this impossible conversation with a forgotten machine had just taken 22 years to finally conclude. He stood up, grabbed Violet's hand, and they walked straight toward the car. For the first 3 days of the next week, he quietly finished 2 everyday jobs at Aaron's garage, work that patiently waited since before the madness started. On that last day, Aaron just shook his hand, holding it a second longer without saying a word. That was exactly the right amount. Owen called that same evening with an update. The German engineering squad contacted Hartwell, asking about a major new research collaboration. They were specifically asking about that impossible Bosch board. They wanted his reprogramming method, convinced the same careful approach could somehow fix at least 9 other completely unrestorable vintage BMWs locked away in private European vaults. Dominic said he'd think it over. Then Giselle called Saturday afternoon straight from her personal number. I want to offer you a long-term consulting arrangement with the group. Flexible schedule, your choice of projects, no office requirements. A quiet pause hung there, completely different from her usual icy silence. I also want you to know the Stuttgart team asked about your training background. You studied under Gerhard Wolfe 3 years. He's considered one of 4 or 5 people in the world who understood the M-Series development program from the inside. Most specialists in this field have never encountered his name. Most specialists in this field wouldn't have needed to. Dominic replied flatly, Send the contract terms through Charlotte. I'll look at them. She stopped, then her tone shifted, softening completely. The Stuttgart team asked what you call your restoration methodology. They want to document it for their archive. He just stared out his kitchen window. From the living room, little Violet hummed softly to herself. A sweet habit inherited from Sarah, who used to hum all day without ever even realizing she was doing it. It doesn't have a name, Dominic quietly replied. It's just doing things in the right order. Total silence fell on her end. Finally, she said, That might be the most accurate description of genuine expertise I've ever heard. Stick with me here. After she hung up, Dominic just sat completely frozen at his kitchen table. He hadn't truly figured out what those $10 million would actually turn into yet. There was still time for that. Over the years, he learned that the choices you make slowly and carefully always hold up better than choices rushed in the blinding flash of sudden change. But he had already made one quiet choice during that long drive home from Hartwell last Friday. He was finally opening a workshop. Nothing huge, nothing built for churning out volume. A proper space with a lift and the exact right tools. And just enough room to rebuild one neglected vehicle at a time, giving it the full respect it deserved. He already kept a secret list in his head, completely unwritten. 7 impossible cars he knew were hiding in private storage facilities across the country. Silent engines and histories left totally incomplete. You and I know the truth. Just broken machines in the dark, waiting for someone patient enough to finally listen. After Violet finally fell asleep, he stepped into the quiet, dimly lit backyard workshop. Picture this. He sat down, spreading an old blue notebook under the glaring work light. The last page held his final notes from 2003. Penned by a younger man, it marked an impossible restoration abandoned long before it was ever finished. He uncapped the pen, flipped to a fresh blank page and wrote today's date with a careful, unhurried rhythm. He understood that unlocking this forgotten treasure required deep respect on paper first. A way to show us that this impossible challenge truly matters, that this treasure is worth recording, that it must be done right, and so he began.